This is a bit of biology with Mr. Rock. Today we're going to be tackling cell membranes, and we're specifically going to be focusing on the structure. Before we focus on the structure, I just want to define what a cell membrane is. A cell membrane is a thin, flexible barrier that goes around a cell which regulates what comes in and what goes out. A cell membrane is an organelle, and it's found in all living cells. So prokaryotes, eukaryotes, animals, plant cells, all of these things have a cell membrane, so it's super important. The cell membrane itself is made up of two different macromolecules, so this is a little bit of a review. Number one, it's going to be the lipids, and then number two, it's going to be the proteins. Defining characteristics about the cell membrane. So what is the cell membrane actually made up of? We typically refer to the cell membrane as a phospholipid bilayer because it's made up of phospholipids, and there's two layers of those phospholipids. So up here on this image, I have a phospholipid. It's characterized by having one polar head, which is polar things are hydrophilic, so they like water. So a hydrophobic head, and then two nonpolar hydrophobic tails. These tails are the lipid part of the phospholipid, and they are the things that hate water. So what these phospholipids wrap all the way around the cell, and it pretty much creates a barrier from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. I have a couple different images here. I gotta say, I've ripped image number one from Bozeman. He describes the cell membrane as a musk ox. The reason why, and I really like his analogy, because when these ox sense danger, what they do is they get around in a circle, and they circle up around the things that are important to them, which are their young. So they get in a circle with their heads facing outside of the circle and their tails facing inside of the circle. And this protects the things that are on the inside, which is the things that they care about. The cell membrane is the exact same way. The only difference is the cell membrane would have ox going around and their heads facing outwards, but then also on the inside of the circle, there would be another group of ox, and those oxen would have their heads facing the inside of the cell with their tails facing the other tails of the oxen. So what I mean by that, this is why we call it a phospholipid bilayer, because we have the polar heads, the heads on the facing the outside and the inside, and we have the tails in the middle. So you can see that in picture 2 and picture 4, where the heads are on the outside and on the inside, and then the tails come together in the middle. Picture number 3 is just an electron micrograph, which is a very, very fancy way to take a picture of a small thing. And it's showing you the cell membrane. 2 arrows are pointing at it. The arrow that's on top is actually in the middle of the lipid bilayer. So that arrow is just right in between the tails, with polar heads being on top and polar heads being on the bottom. I just have this image here because I really like the image. It shows a cell. Intracellular means on the inside, extracellular means on the outside, and this is what a cell membrane looks like in cartoon version. So number 1, most of the cell membrane is made up of the phospholipid bilayer. So it's made up of many different phospholipids, one layer on top, one layer on bottom, the heads facing the inside and the outside. However, we also have different types of proteins. So we have a protein channel, we have protein gates, and we have protein receptors. And these proteins do different things for the cell. So here I have just the defining characteristics of each macromolecule. So 1, lipids, they're going to make up the barrier for the cell membrane that goes all the way around. But what the proteins do is sometimes we need stuff to come into the cells. We need nutrients. We need to send things out like enzymes. We need to bring in bacteria to destroy them. So sometimes we got to bring stuff in and we got to take stuff out. So we need stuff to move across, and proteins allow us to do that. So there are channel proteins which are going to allow things to move in and out of the cell membrane. And then we also have receptor proteins, because a unique thing about cells is they're constantly communicating with each other. So proteins are going to be the receptor that sends a signal to other cells to allow them to communicate. It's their way of communication. Your immune system cells do this all the time. They're constantly communicating with one another to keep you healthy. Okay, so this is a really big idea that I need you to take away from cell membrane structure is the idea of selective permeability. And it describes a membrane that allows only certain molecules to pass freely. So some things can move across a cell membrane. But what's going to dictate if they move across is, number one, their charge, and then number two, their size. So their charge is based off of their polarity. If they're negative, positively charged, they can't move across. Their size is just big or small. So really small things like gas can move across, but really big things like glycogen cannot. Okay, I have to use my favorite guy ever, Gandalf, saying "you shall not pass," because that is constantly what the cell membranes are saying. You shall not pass, and they're constantly saying that to different molecules. So like I said, this is selective permeability, and some molecules can move across and others cannot. So gases, things like carbon dioxide, oxygen, they can move across the phospholipid bilayer freely because they're small. Water, on the other hand, water cannot, because when water tries to move across, it's going to meet the lipid tails. And it does not like the hydrophobic lipid tails because it's water versus oil, and those two things are not going to mix. So water cannot pass the phospholipid, but there are protein channels that we were just talking about called aquaporins, and they're embedded in the phospholipids. They're a door for the water to move through. So water can move across the cell membrane, but it needs proteins to do it. And then big molecules, things like salt, things like glycogen, things like bacteria, these are things that cannot move across the cell membrane because it is simply too big. So big molecules, things with charges cannot move across the phospholipid, but if there is a channel for a molecule, then it can move across. This has been a bit of biology with Mr. Rock. I'm signing off.